عنك فهمني هاو الفوق اجمالي عطاك ولكن حالتني كاتل حالتني متعبه
Once the last French troops finally left Tunisian soil in 1963 for the first time in centuries, the Tunisian people had a nation of their own. The new head of government, President Bourguiba, implemented ambivalent reforms. Al-Zabari writes of Bourguiba's introduction of the most liberal family and personal status law in North Africa. Yet, on the political level, he solidified his rule through the system of a single-party authoritarian regime. Nevertheless, in the eyes of most Tunisian people, he was an icon, a hero to the people, a symbol of resistance against the old colonial regime, earning him the title of Supreme Combatant and Father of the Nation. Overshadowed by his legendary status, there persisted an undercurrent within parts of the public who were deeply concerned and angered by his politicking and repression of political opponents. And whilst he publicly eschewed the protectorate's goal of censorship and control over the media, encouraging people to create media outlets, newspapers, and radio shows, the reality remained that media was still heavily controlled by his government. Facing economic and state pressures, the media had to maintain a certain veil of neutrality. There were critiques and discussions around social or political issues, but in Benarrous's words, quote, "The only red line was President Bourguiba, and any criticism of him led to an immediate sanction." Though many Tunisians today still see Bourguiba as a heroic figure of decolonial struggle and as the founding father of the nation, some of the myths around the man have begun to unravel over the years. Writers, poets, artists, and journalists have shed light over the past decades on Bourguiba's post-colonial authoritarianism. More specifically, how his neo-Destorian party reigned supreme on the political scene, disallowing other parties from elections.
Radio Tunis was Tunisia's first public radio station. It broadcasted its services in Arabic, French, and Italian since 1938 and remained one of the only sources of information for citizens listening to the radio. Bourguiba did not allow private radio stations during this time, and though for years they mostly catered to a religious population, radio in Tunisia eventually became the source for news, entertainment, and of course politics that we know today. Regional radio stations were set up throughout the country, but it was all publicly owned and managed. The country would have to wait until 2003 for the very first private radio station to hit the airwaves. Large portions of the population were not necessarily opposed to Bourguiba's efforts to modernize Tunisia. In fact, whether it was literacy rates, health outcomes, or women's rights, life in Tunisia improved markedly. However, there was genuine anger and frustration towards his policy of repression against opponents, but Bourguiba was meticulous in the management of his reputation. Kamel Labidi, journalist and representative of the Committee to Protect Journalists, writes that early on, Bourguiba saw the Tunisian General Labour Union, or the UGTT, as a key ally in his struggle to transform the country. After all, the UGTT was, quote, "one of the finest unions in Africa and the Arab world." But by co-opting and controlling the unions, Bourguiba also curtailed any opposition from rising in the ranks of workers and labour organisers. According to Labidi, there were times in the earlier period of his rule when universities were permitted places for public debates and forums. But as Bourguiba's interest in controlling narratives grew by the end of the 1960s, quote, "there was extreme repression of student groups in response to the prevailing mood of opposition on campuses. The clampdown coincided with the regime's introduction of free market policies." Pressed by decades of struggle by pioneer women around the country, Bourguiba enshrined the Code of Personal Status in 1956, which abolished many of the most egregious gender inequalities. Although these were real material gains for women across the nation, Professor Dora Mahfoud Draoui explains that this was also an instrumentalization of the feminist struggle. Taking over the struggle and brandishing it as state feminism allowed Bourguiba to, quote, "give himself an image of liberator of women, guarantor of their dignity and their rights." The women leading the struggles for feminist liberation would go on to distance themselves from this state feminism. and according to Professor Drawi, form an autonomous feminist movement refusing the dominating and paternalist nature of the state on women's rights and ensuring that freedom for women in Tunisia was not left to men in power.
Though he carefully styled and portrayed himself as a president, Bourguiba's presidential powers extended way beyond that of his peers in other liberal democracies, as he secured a position in which no legislative or judicial body could remove him. In fact, for historian Hisham Abdesamad, the more opposition to his reign grew, the stronger the state and security apparatus became to counter such movements. As he so succinctly put it himself, quote, "The system? What system? I am the system." Bourguiba's quest for a unified nation of Tunisians grew more and more ruthless. Communities around the country who lived outside the national norms set by Bourguiba in the constitution needed to be brought to heel for him to meet his goal of a single government, constitution, and set of laws. As Abdelkrim El-Agui writes, Bourguiba shut down rabbinical courts, dissolved local Jewish councils and emergency fundraising, and imposed a Grand Rabbi of Tunisia, a position which the Jewish community nominated themselves in the past through their council. Bourguiba's fists gradually tightened around civil life as his authoritarian tendencies worsened. Any critique by newspapers or radio of the president, and sometimes his government, could lead to their closure. A so-called alternative police body was established to undertake surveillance of political opponents, targeting Islamists and communists, and their families and loved ones both in Tunisia and abroad. Dr. Abderrahman Daraji notes how colonial torture methods, endured for many years under the French protectorate, were then used by Bourguiba, a man who fought for principles of freedom and civil liberties, who opposed the colonial rule of France, suffocated the same ideals through countless instances of beatings, burns, electrocution, sleep deprivation, injection of varied substances, and even the most extreme sexual violence. This escalated towards the end of his rule, in which he brutally repressed bread riots and political unrest, famously overseeing the barbaric shooting of hundreds of striking civilians and union members in what came to be called Black Thursday, echoing the brutal actions of French troops in Djelaz. In his project to shape Tunisia along the lines of, quote, 19th century positivist ideals and of triumphant laicity, opposing any revival of religion, Bourguiba set his sights on communists, political opponents, but also, perhaps most notably, Islamists. While carefully constructing his reputation, he instrumentalized religion and religious symbols to legitimize his reign and reforms. On one hand, he challenged the clerical elite throughout his reign, but on the other, he enshrined Islam as a religion of the nation, and the prerequisite of Islamic faith for any president. Bourguiba claimed that as president he was an imam, but also campaigned to stop the slowing down of Tunisian activities and consumerism during Ramadan. These were not necessarily contradictions, but rather examples of his pragmatism towards religion and his instrumentalization of societal components for political gains. In the 1970s, under the leadership of Rashid al-Ghannouchi, a group of sheikhs led the popular revival of political Islam. Highly critical of the Western-styled modernization program, their efforts coalesced into the Islamic Tendency movement, offering an overtly religious alternative to Bourguiba's secular modernism. They accused Bourguiba of attacking religious institutions of the country in his post-independence efforts and denounced his blaming them for his own policy failures. The Islamists' work, which they conceived of as focused on the development of ideological conscience, essentially a critique of the Western concepts which dominate the spirit of youth, presenting an Islamic alternative. According to scholar Marian Bulby, the organization was regarded with increasing suspicion by the government, believed to be taking over strategic parts of the political landscape to fight Bourguiba's party. They were forced to operate, quote, outside the legal parameters of the system. From 1976 on, Ghannouchi's Islamist MTI organization operated mostly underground, away from prying eyes. Their level of organization developed and they grew in size until they formed an outright political party, espousing views outside of their previously rigid Islamist foundations of, quote, liberty, equality, dignity, and progress against exploitation and underdevelopment, despotism, and dependency in all its forms. words which, Boulby notes, echoed Bourguiba's own during the days of Tunisia's anti-colonial revolution. Bourguiba felt threatened enough by the MTI that he denied them political recognition and ordered the arrest of 61 members in 1981 over unproven links to acts of Islamist violence. Quote, publications were outlawed, mosques carefully supervised, and traditional Islamic dress was forbidden in schools and government offices, as the president sought to quell the religious movement. In the years that followed, MTI politicians would often be the targets of political crusades for acts committed by others. This increased tensions between secular and Islamists in the country, and even caught the attention of various Islamist groups in the Middle East. Ghannouchi, the leader of the movement, was sent to prison and tortured, freed, then sentenced again to life in prison, and released once more. Although he was forced to take refuge in the UK for the next 22 years, the Islamist cause continued to grow in strength. The Tunisian political elite could no longer ignore the issue or wish it away.
Bourguiba, secure in his position of president for life, was genuinely adored by many. As Hopwood and Terry write, he used to give lectures on his life and achievements, which government officials and students alike were summoned to listen to. And to be fair, he had accomplished many things during his reign, especially considering this was the time of decolonization, which is often, quote, complex, untidy, and violent, involving, as it must, the replacement of one system of organizing power with another. It can be traumatic and destructive. This isn't a justification or defense of Bourguiba's actions throughout the years, nor the horrors born from his rule, but rather an important contextualization. These actions followed centuries of Ottoman beylical rule, generations of brutal French colonial regime, and crisis upon crisis as Tunisia struggled out of its past and into the 20th century world. As L. Carl Brown writes, it is poignant that the man who accomplished so much stayed on too long, and thus contributed to the unravelling of his masterwork. His carefully crafted cult of personality broke apart piece by piece over the many years of his relentless rule from 1956 until the shell that remained in 1987. A physically and mentally decrepit old man was simply put aside like a worn-out toy. Because as always, in came the new, in this case Zine El Abidine Ben Ali, Tunisia's second president and the antagonist of Tunisia's famous 2011 revolution.